There are three things Caroline Kennedy kept. Not the rocking chair, not the golf clubs, not the triple-strand pearl necklace that appeared in every museum-quality photograph of her mother's White House years, a necklace Jackie had picked up at Bergdorf Goodman for $35, and that, by the time it went under the hammer at Sotheby's in April 1996, had become something close to a national relic. At auction, it sold for $211,500. Bidders from 19 countries competed for it. Not a single item in the entire 4-day sale went unsold. What she kept was quieter. A 19th-century diamond sunburst brooch her mother had acquired in 1961. Not a piece from the official wardrobe, not a gift from a foreign head of state, but something Jackie chose for herself, trading in 2 diamond leaf brooches she had received as wedding gifts from her in-laws to offset the cost. In 2009, Caroline wore it to the Kennedy Center Honors. In 2012, she wore it again. That brooch has never appeared in an auction catalog. She kept a pair of Van Cleef & Arpels diamond earrings, a delicate cascade of marquise and round-cut diamonds that John Kennedy gave Jackie in 1957. The occasion was Caroline's birth. Jackie privately called them Caroline's earrings for the rest of her life. After Jackie died in May 1994, they passed to her daughter. Caroline has worn them at galas and commemorations and memorial events, at the moments when the Kennedy name is formally invoked, and she is the one standing there to hold it. And she kept the rings, plural. In September 1963, 6 weeks before Dallas, JFK gave Jackie a custom Van Cleef & Arpels eternity ring for their 10th wedding anniversary. 10 stones, including an emerald cut to represent Ireland. Jackie wore it next to her wedding band and, by accounts of those closest to her, never took it off. Not through the year of mourning, not through the remarriage, not through the decades that followed. In the early 1970s, she had 2 stones removed from the ring and made into 2 solitaire rings, one for Caroline, one for her son John. When John Kennedy Jr. died in the July 1999 plane crash off Martha's Vineyard, his ring eventually returned to his sister. Caroline now holds all 3, the modified original eternity ring, her own solitaire, and her brother's. These aren't the most valuable things Jackie owned. They aren't the most famous. But they are the ones Caroline chose to keep while releasing nearly everything else, over 5,000 objects, to the 4-day Sotheby's auction that generated $34.5 million and drew bids from 19 countries. The demand was absolute. The public hunger for fragments of Jackie's life had no floor. What Caroline retained from that vast dispersal, and why, is the story of what it costs to be the last person responsible for a myth. Jackie Kennedy didn't simply marry into public life. She engineered it. When John Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th president on January 20, 1961, Jackie was 31 years old. She had already chosen her designer, Oleg Cassini, a Russian-born Hollywood costumer she and her advisors selected specifically because his eye for theatrical silhouette could transform her physical presence into a visual argument for everything the Kennedy White House was supposed to represent. Cassini became, as the press labeled him, her Secretary of Style. Together they created what fashion writers called the Jackie look: clean lines, pillbox hats, deliberate minimalism. Almost no jewelry except glittering earrings. Copies of her clothes appeared in department stores within months. A 2024 history thesis from Providence College traced how Jackie's wardrobe functioned as Cold War diplomatic currency, broadcast in a televised White House tour seen around the world. One contemporary assessment of the CBS broadcast was direct. Jackie Kennedy was 90% of the program's success. When the Kennedys visited France in 1961, President Kennedy joked at a formal dinner, I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I have enjoyed it. The State Department understood her image as a geopolitical instrument. She was performing a function, and she knew it. Then, November 22, 1963, Air Force One, the blood-stained pink suit. Lyndon Johnson swearing in, with Jackie standing at his side, still wearing what she had worn in Dallas. She told Lady Bird Johnson, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." She kept the suit on, unwashed, through the swearing in, through the flight home, through the photographs that circulated for the next 6 decades. Art historian David Lubin at Wake Forest University observed in 2004 that keeping that clothing on was completely consistent with her realization that clothing is a medium of expression, and she wanted to say something to the world. The suit was never cleaned. It sits in storage at the National Archives and won't be released to public view until at least 2103. Jackie walked behind the coffin. She lit the eternal flame. She planned every detail of the state funeral on the model of Abraham Lincoln's. She remained composed in public through the entire ordeal, with a precision that the millions watching on television experienced not as stoicism, but as something beyond human instinct, as though she understood, even in the worst hours of her life, that she was performing a national function. The British journalist Jean Campbell, filing from Washington for the London Evening Standard, wrote that Jacqueline Kennedy had given America the one thing it has always lacked, and that is majesty. Norman Mailer had written about her for Esquire in July 1962 and called her the prisoner of celebrity. He was right, but the cage was partly of her own construction. She wasn't merely a person the public observed. She was an object America had created to project itself onto. Beauty, tragedy, youth, culture, femininity, and power, all compressed into a single frame. And she inhabited that function with extraordinary control. Her celebrity was so total that even her grief became a kind of national property. That control created a standard. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was born November 27, 1957, 5 days shy of her 6th birthday when her father was shot in Dallas. She grew up in the White House, photographed constantly by Cecil Stoughton, the official White House photographer, and by Jacques Lowe, the Kennedy family photographer, riding her pony Macaroni across the South Lawn, sitting in her father's chair in the Oval Office, peeking out from beneath his desk. Those images have since appeared in museum exhibitions, presidential library retrospectives, and documentary films about what America lost in November 1963. She didn't know, at 3 and 4 and 5 years old, that her childhood was already a public inheritance. Her biographers noted that she carried a striking physical resemblance to her mother, a likeness that became more pronounced as she aged. One account put it plainly. If you encountered her on the street without knowing her name, you might not recognize her at all. But placed next to a photograph of Jacqueline Kennedy at the same age, the resemblance was unmistakable. She didn't ask for any of it. The world has never been interested in what she asked for. 6 days after the assassination, Jackie Kennedy invited Theodore H. White, a Life magazine journalist she trusted, to the Kennedy family home in Hyannisport. She sat with him for hours, deep into the night, and told him what she wanted the world to remember. "Don't let it be forgot," she said. Quoting the Lerner and Loewe Broadway musical, she told him JFK had loved to listen to at night when his back hurt too much for sleep. That once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment, that was known as Camelot. She added, "There'll be great presidents again, and the Johnsons are wonderful. They've been wonderful to me. But there'll never be another Camelot again." When White called his editors at Life to dictate the draft, Jackie overheard the conversation. According to White's own memoir account, she shook her head at the editing. She wanted Camelot to lead the story. Life's editors had already decided there was too much of the word in White's copy, Jackie insisted. The article, titled "For President Kennedy, an Epilogue," ran in the December 6, 1963 issue exactly as she demanded. White would later write, "I was her instrument in labeling the myth because she was concerned about history and wanted me to help him be remembered. And so, after a long night's talk, she urged my using the word Camelot to describe it all." Years after, White reversed himself. "The magic Camelot of John F. Kennedy never existed," he wrote, calling it a misreading of history. But by then, it didn't matter. The myth was load-bearing in the American imagination, and nothing would shift it. Scholars writing 60 years later still found that the American people continued to regard the slain president with admiration, even as historians examined his actual record with increasing skepticism. The myth and the man had separated. The myth survived. The Kennedy family had always understood tragedy as a recurring condition of the name. Joe Kennedy Jr., the eldest son and his father's chosen political heir, died in August 1944 when his bomber exploded over the English Channel. His body was never recovered. Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, died in a plane crash in May 1948. JFK was killed in 1963. Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles in June 1968. The pattern accumulated across decades. The press eventually coined a term, the Kennedy curse, and it became a fixture of popular history. The family never used that language publicly. They absorbed each loss and continued. Rose Kennedy, the family matriarch, articulated the philosophy once in writing. "It has been said, time heals all wounds. I don't agree. The wounds remain. In time, the mind, protecting its sanity, covers them with scar tissue, and the pain lessens. But it's never gone." That isn't a statement of helpless grief. It's a statement about what grief costs and how a family chooses to carry it. Internally, persistently, without display. Public composure wasn't performed indifference. It was the operating code. Jackie absorbed that code and refined it. She seldom gave interviews once she left the White House. She produced no memoir. Her biographer observed, "Because of her staunch devotion to privacy and her decision to shun most interviews and a personal memoir, Jacqueline Kennedy remains an enigma." She wasn't an enigma. She was a person who understood that controlled silence is its own kind of authority, and that the less you contribute to the noise, the more completely you control what the noise is about. In early 1964, still in acute grief, she sat with historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. for 7 oral history interviews recorded over 3 months, totaling 8.5 hours. Her memories of the White House, of her husband, of the administration as she experienced it from the inside. Then she sealed the tapes, deposited them at the Kennedy Library, an institution that didn't yet exist when the recordings were made, and left instructions that they weren't to be released during her lifetime. She built an archive, sealed it, and left her children as the only people with authority over it. Caroline was 6 years old. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994, of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was 64 years old. In the months before her death, she had already begun planning what would happen to her possessions, not arbitrarily, but deliberately, in conversation with her lawyer, Alexander Forger, and with Caroline and John Jr. The Sotheby's auction wasn't something her children decided in the aftermath. Jackie had initiated the concept herself, working through the logistics with her family before she died. When Caroline walked through her mother's 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, the penthouse overlooking Central Park that Jackie had bought in July 1964 for $200,000, the home where she had rebuilt her life after Dallas, the home where she died. She was completing a plan her mother had designed. The decisions about what to release and what to retain existed within a framework Jackie had already established. Hundreds of items went to the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston before a single auction lot was cataloged. Caroline and John Jr. chose what they wanted to keep personally. What remained, over 5,000 objects, went to Sotheby's. The BBC's Tom Brooke reported that Sotheby's officials themselves described the sale as leftovers, specifically not masterpieces but the leftovers that neither her children nor the Kennedy Library chose to keep. The children had already made their selections. Sotheby's received what was left after history and personal feeling had each taken their share. The 4-day auction ran April 23rd through 26th, 1996, at Sotheby's York Avenue sales rooms. First session began at 7:30 p.m. on the 23rd. The pre-sale estimate was $4.6 million. Bids came from 19 countries. As many as 125,000 absentee bids were received. When the last lot closed, the total reached $34.5 million, exceeding the estimate by roughly 650%. Not a single item went unsold. Sotheby's chief executive Diana Brooks had described the auction catalog in advance as revealing a very elegant apartment that was also very much a home, with an obvious emphasis on comfort and warmth. What was actually being sold, as the BBC reporter observed, was the glamour and style embodied by the former First Lady. A triple-strand necklace of fake pearls, estimated at $500 to $700, sold for $211,500 because Jackie had been photographed wearing it with her toddler son tugging at the strands. And that photograph had become one of the most circulated images of the Kennedy White House era. Arnold Schwarzenegger, then married to JFK's niece Maria Shriver, paid $772,500 for a set of McGregor golf clubs inscribed JFK, Washington, D.C. A child's rocking horse sold for $85,000. Jackie's schoolgirl French textbook, with her teenage fashion doodles filling the margins, sold for $42,550. JFK's desk, the one where he had signed the partial nuclear test ban treaty, sold for $1.3 million. The presidential humidor went for $574,500. The Aristotle Onassis engagement ring, a 40-carat Lesotho diamond, sold for $2.59 million, purchased by Heinz chairman Anthony O'Reilly for his wife. Every dollar went to charity, not to Caroline, not to John Jr. The New York Times noted in its March 1996 preview that the proceeds would go to the JFK Library Foundation, not to Sotheby's, Mrs. Schlossberg, or Mr. Kennedy. In the catalog introduction, Caroline and her brother wrote, "She was proud to have played a part in the history of our country, and in accordance with her wishes, we have given objects and documents which help chronicle the Kennedy administration and her role as First Lady to the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation." The sale was an act of institutional release, framed explicitly as completion of Jackie's wishes. Now, what wasn't in the catalog? The 19th century diamond sunburst brooch went to Caroline personally. So did the Van Cleef and Arpels earrings given at Caroline's birth. So did the 3 rings derived from the anniversary Eternity ring, the original modified piece, plus the 2 solitaires Jackie had made from its stones in the early 1970s. Jackie's engagement ring from JFK, the Van Cleef and Arpels Toi et Moi, with its 2.88 carat diamond and 2.84 carat emerald, wasn't sold. It was placed permanently at the JFK Library in Boston, accessible to researchers and visitors. Jackie's White House wardrobe went to the Kennedy Library archives. The wedding bracelet JFK gave Jackie the night before their 1953 wedding, 25 diamonds and 18 pearls set between nautical rope borders, was donated to the Kennedy Library and Museum. The items that went to auction are overwhelmingly the ones associated with Jackie as public figure and icon. The Onassis ring, the White House pearls, the rocking chair, JFK's golf clubs, the presidential desk, the humidor. The items that didn't go to auction are predominantly those associated with private relationship. An anniversary ring modified so both children could carry a piece of it, earrings given at a daughter's birth, a brooch Jackie chose for herself by trading away the formal gifts of her marriage. Public myth, released. Private relationship, held. The distinction between those two categories represents a very specific kind of deliberateness, the capacity to separate what belonged to history from what belonged to her alone. In 2001, Caroline edited a book of her mother's favorite poems, including several Jackie had written herself, illustrated with Kennedy family photographs and accompanied by Caroline's own written reflections on her mother's life and work. It wasn't a biography, not a revelation, a carefully shaped memorial, the kind of artifact a person makes when they want to offer something of the person they loved without surrendering the parts that felt too interior for public consumption. Then came the larger decision about the tapes. Those 7 oral history sessions Jackie had recorded with Arthur Schlesinger in the spring of 1964, sealed for 47 years, Caroline chose to release in September 2011. She edited the transcripts herself in collaboration with presidential historian Michael Beschloss. The book was published by Hyperion. The audio recordings were included. An exclusive broadcast arrangement was struck with ABC News and Diane Sawyer for a 2-hour primetime special that aired September 14, 2011. At the forum held at the Kennedy Library on October 3, 2011, Caroline explained her decision in her mother's terms. It took a good deal of courage for my mother to be as honest as she was, but her own reading of the chronicles of the past convinced her that future generations would benefit from her commitment to tell the truth as she saw it. It wasn't easy, but she felt that she was doing this for my father's sake and for history. The JFK Library Foundation praised her for demonstrating her trust in the general public and posterity to judge. 47 years. The tapes existed. She knew what was in them. She chose, for 4.5 decades, to hold them. And then she chose, at the 50-year anniversary of the Kennedy administration, to release them with context, with historical annotation, with a scholar's apparatus to frame them responsibly. That year, the JFK Library press release noted that during the anniversary period, additional material is being donated by Caroline Kennedy and will be processed and opened to the public, including memos and correspondence from the White House and clothing, jewelry, scrapbooks, and photographs. The JFK Library Foundation newsletter from that same year identified her title, President of the Kennedy Library Foundation. Her husband, Edwin Schlossberg, the museum designer she married in 1986, had redesigned the museum itself and chaired the foundation's board. The library wasn't a cause she attached her name to for optics. She ran it. In 2005, she had also held a second auction at Sotheby's, this one including additional family possessions from the Kennedy properties at Hyannisport, Peapack, Middleburg, and Martha's Vineyard. The 1996 sale wasn't a single act of closure. For 30 years and counting, she has continued to make deliberate decisions about what to hold and what to release, what to donate and what to keep personal, what history gets and what remains hers. After John Kennedy Jr. died on July 16, 1999, his plane disappearing into the Atlantic off Martha's Vineyard, his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren also killed, Caroline was the only surviving member of President Kennedy's immediate family. Scholars studying the Kennedy dynasty wrote that when her brother died in 1999, Caroline was declared the last keeper of Camelot. Academic analysis of the family used the phrase sole keeper of the flame, the sole survivor of a family that in its heyday dominated American public life. She didn't hold a public memorial service for her brother. She decided his remains would be cremated and his ashes scattered into the Atlantic off Martha's Vineyard, near where he died. That was her decision. Then she went back to work. On January 27, 2008, Caroline Kennedy published an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "A President Like My Father." It opened, "Over the years, I've been deeply moved by the people who've told me they wished they could feel inspired and hopeful about America, the way people did when my father was president. This sense is even more profound today. That is why I am supporting a presidential candidate in the Democratic primaries, Barack Obama." Her closing lines were explicit about what she was asking. "I've never had a president who inspired me the way people tell me that my father inspired them. But for the first time, I believe I have found the man who could be that president, not just for me, but for a new generation of Americans." The New York Post ran a headline, "Caroline Kennedy, Barack like my dad." Multiple outlets characterized the piece as breaking her lifelong silence. The day after it published, she and her uncle Ted Kennedy, already diagnosed with the brain tumor that would kill him the following year, jointly endorsed Obama at American University in Washington. She then served as co-chair of his vice presidential search committee and addressed the Democratic National Convention in Denver on August 25, 2008. Scholars of the 2008 election subsequently wrote that the Kennedy endorsement carried symbolic weight that can't be understated. Not merely political support, but dynastic transfer. The surviving Camelot endorsing a candidate explicitly framed as its heir. Obama won. He nominated her as U.S. Ambassador to Japan in 2013. She became the first woman to hold the position. The New York Times reported the appointment as expected among those familiar with the process. A Massachusetts editorial ran the headline, "Caroline Kennedy Ready to Claim Family Legacy." Her grandfather, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., had served as U.S. Ambassador to Britain from 1938 to 1940. A 2014 Johns Hopkins SAIS study specifically examined the Kennedy family's role in U.S.-Japan diplomatic relations. The symbolism was legible across the Pacific. She served in Tokyo from November 2013 through January 2017. In July 2022, President Biden appointed her ambassador to Australia. She served until November 2024. At the official ceremony marking the 50th anniversary of JFK's inauguration, held in the Rotunda of the United States Capitol on January 20, 2011, Caroline received a standing ovation from an audience of 500 before she spoke. Her closing remarks were preserved in full by the JFK Library Foundation. "Half a century ago on this date, a few minutes before noon, my father walked across this rotunda to the inaugural platform. Here, in this same place, 1,000 days later, Americans lined up in the hundreds of thousands to say goodbye. I was here then, and I remember it. His time was short, but his summons still echoes, and it always will." She was 3 years old at the inauguration, 5 years old at the funeral. 6 decades later, she is still the one standing in the rotunda. At that same event, she and Edwin Schlossberg hosted a private reception in the Kennedy Caucus Room at the Russell Senate Office Building, the room where her father had announced his candidacy for the presidency. Among the guests, Peace Corps volunteers, astronauts, civil rights activists, musicians, and community organizers who had answered JFK's call to service. The Foundation newsletter described it as a gathering of people who had lived out what the inaugural address asked of them. Caroline organized it, hosted it, presided over it. The legacy wasn't something she simply stood near. It was something she convened. Each public role has been built around the same operating principle: significance commensurate with the name, exposure calibrated to what the name requires rather than what the media economy demands. Here is what is structurally unusual about Caroline Kennedy's public life. The less she says, the more powerful her appearances become. She has given almost no general interviews. No memoir exists. She hasn't sold her story, not authorized a biography, not performed vulnerability for cultural capital on the platforms the modern media economy has built for exactly that purpose. By the metrics those platforms use to measure participation, she barely registers. And yet, she ran the Kennedy Library Foundation as its president. She spent 2 years as director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships for the New York City Department of Education, a 3-day-a-week position that paid her $1 a year, and helped raise more than $65 million for New York City public schools. She co-wrote 2 books on constitutional law, In Our Defense in 1991 and The Right to Privacy in 1995. She has authored or edited 10 books in total. She endorsed a presidential candidate in a nationally published op-ed that moved the 2008 Democratic primary. She co-chaired a vice presidential search committee. She represented the Kennedy family at the funerals of Presidents Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford, and First Ladies Lady Bird Johnson, Nancy Reagan, and Barbara Bush. She served as a U.S. ambassador twice on 2 different continents under 2 different presidents. Her public life is substantial. What she has systematically avoided is the performance of interiority. She hasn't discussed her grief in interviews. She hasn't offered retrospective accounts of growing up inside the most scrutinized family in American history. She hasn't described her parents' marriage, the experience of losing her brother, or any of the material that the public appetite for Kennedy content would consume without limit. Biographers have noted that if you encountered her without knowing her name, you wouldn't necessarily recognize her, a quality almost inconceivable for someone of her background. One account put it directly. You'd never have guessed that she was Caroline Kennedy, daughter of the late President and Jackie Kennedy, arguably the most famous woman in the world. She inherited this from her mother. Jackie left no memoir and gave only a handful of interviews across 3 decades of post-White House life. She shaped the record she chose to shape and declined to fill in the rest. The Sotheby's official who spoke to the BBC in 1996 described the auction catalog as catering to a public hunger to find out what went on behind the impenetrable Jackie Onassis facade. Impenetrable. That word is precise. Jackie had constructed an image so complete and so brilliantly maintained that there was nothing obvious to see through it. And that was the design. The public received the version she chose. Everything else stayed behind it. Caroline has run the same operation for 30 years since her mother's death, in a quieter register and with a different kind of cultural position. Jackie's privacy existed in permanent tension with a visual icon identity she had consciously built and that she couldn't fully control once it was in the world. Caroline never built that kind of image. She isn't visually iconic in the way her mother was. She is historically significant and genealogically powerful, which are different things. What she has constructed is an absence that functions as its own kind of authority, the authority of someone who holds the archive and controls what comes out of it. The one time she moved toward a larger and more exposed public role, the 2008 to 2009 period when she explored seeking appointment to Hillary Clinton's vacated New York Senate seat, she withdrew for personal reasons. Press coverage framed the withdrawal as confirmation of a pre-existing narrative, too private, too sheltered, unsuited to relentless visibility. What that coverage missed is the distinction between the exposure a Senate seat demands and the kind a diplomatic post provides. Ambassadorships offer consequence without constant media availability. You are present in the rooms where decisions happen. Your name carries historical weight in the countries where you serve, and you aren't required to perform yourself for an audience every day. She chose the diplomatic track twice, under 2 different presidents, across 2 different continents. Other Kennedy women built their public presence differently. Maria Shriver, Kennedy's first cousin, who served as her matron of honor at her 1986 wedding, with Ted Kennedy walking her down the aisle, built a journalism career, a political career as California's First Lady, and a sustained public intellectual presence. Other cousins run foundations, appear at advocacy events, and participate in the ongoing theater of Kennedy family prominence. Caroline's biography reads as a series of significant appearances, each load-bearing, each precisely placed, each connected to the specific function of holding and transmitting the Kennedy legacy, and very little else. A myth that is constantly explained eventually stops being a myth and becomes something less, a historical period, a political legacy, a subject for biographies. The silence around it's what keeps it generative. What you withhold, the public imagines. What you protect, the public wants. Jackie understood this intuitively and acted on it systematically. Caroline has continued the practice for 30 years after her mother's death, with the same result. The Kennedy myth remains, in 2026, as present in American cultural life as it was in 1963. There is no other family in American history for whom this is true. There is a piece Caroline Kennedy published in Elle Decor in 2025, in which she mentions attending the Winter Antique Show with her mother for many years. It isn't a memoir, not a revelation. One specific detail, mother and daughter, a recurring private pleasure, offered with no elaboration. The door closes again immediately. Jackie's engagement ring from JFK sits in a display case at the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, where researchers can examine it. The wedding bracelet JFK gave Jackie the night before their 1953 wedding. 25 diamonds, 18 pearls, 2 nautical rope borders, is also at the library. These are the objects of the official record: the First Lady, the administration, history. They belong to institutional memory. The sunburst brooch Jackie bought partly by trading in her in-laws' wedding gifts, the earrings given at Caroline's birth, and the rings derived from a 10th anniversary gift that Jackie wore until she died, those belong to Caroline. She wears them at the specific events where the Kennedy name is formally invoked: Kennedy Center honors, Library Foundation events, commemorations, the moments when someone must stand there and represent what the family meant to America. She chooses which pieces to wear on which occasions. She knows what each one carries and what each one costs to carry in public. In January 2025, she published a letter opposing her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. She called him, in documented language submitted directly to U.S. senators, a predator, and made her objections specific and substantiated. The letter was posted through her son Jack Schlossberg's Instagram page. Then the letter was done, and she returned to her ordinary absence from public discourse. That is the rhythm across 60 years. Long periods of silence, then an appearance calibrated precisely to its moment, then silence again. Never the sustained exposure that would allow the myth to be replaced by something ordinary. Theodore White, looking back on the night in December 1963 when he sat with Jackie at Hyannisport, wrote that she had been determined to shape what history would say about her husband. She succeeded beyond anything he had anticipated. She created a myth so durable that even his own later insistence that it had never existed couldn't displace it. The myth outlasted its critics, outlasted its author, outlasted Jackie herself. Now it has outlasted all of them except Caroline. She was 5 years old in that rotunda, kneeling beside her mother at the casket in white gloves, photographed by every camera in the room and by history itself, before she had the language to understand what was happening. She grew up inside that frame, educated at the Brearley School, Concord Academy, Radcliffe College, and Columbia Law School, graduating in the top 10% of her law class in 1988, passing the New York Bar in 1989, working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, marrying Edwin Schlossberg in 1986, raising 3 children named Rose, Tatiana, and Jack, and spent the next 4 decades doing the careful institutional work of someone who understands that a legend requires active maintenance, not passive reverence. She brought the sealed tapes out of storage after 47 years because she had built the context to release them responsibly. She directed her mother's most publicly significant possessions to the library, and her most privately meaningful ones to herself. She has worn the earrings JFK gave Jackie when Caroline was born at the specific kinds of events where wearing them carries meaning. Not casually, but as a form of communication, the way a diplomat signals intent through the objects she chooses to bring to a room. The 1996 auction catalog described itself as addressing a public hunger to find out what went on behind the impenetrable Jackie Onassis facade. 30 years later, the hunger hasn't diminished. New films, new books, new documentaries appear annually. The Kennedy Library's digital archive draws researchers and tourists and school children. The channel you're watching made a video about 3 pieces of jewelry, and 15,000 people watched it in the first month. America does not know how to put this family down, and there is one person left who decides how much they are allowed to pick it up. The diamond sunburst brooch Jackie acquired in 1961, paying for it in part by trading in the wedding gifts her in-laws had given her, the brooches that represented her formal entry into a family and a life that became Camelot, isn't in any museum. It isn't available for public study. It isn't in an auction catalog. It's with Caroline Kennedy, wherever she is, the way a letter from someone you loved is with you. The earrings from the year of Caroline's birth, the rings from an anniversary 6 weeks before Dallas, the entire arc of what the marriage was before the world broke it open and claimed it, held in 3 pieces by the one person who has the right to decide what they mean. Caroline Kennedy didn't just keep pieces of her mother's jewelry. She kept the last fragile pieces of a myth America still refuses to put down. Subscribe for more stories like this.